All right. So we are recording. Today we will talk about annotation properties. This is going to be kind of like an explanation of what an annotation property is, how we create a new one. There's probably a lot of it that a lot of you already know, but I know we have new people here, so it should be, hopefully it should be helpful. We have here, we all have access to this. I can also put it in the chat here. This is our homepage where we have all the schedule. There's a link to some notes where everything I'm going to say is here, with some images that you can see here. I am not going to read this, so but it is a good thing for you to have as a for later when you go back to this lesson. Okay, well, let's just do it. So I think here in this group, we're all aware and we're all knowledgeable about protege and ontology in general. And we are aware, hopefully, that ontology terms have annotations. Like this example here, if you don't see my screen, just say something, assuming everybody can see this. So we have a bunch of annotations here, like the label, the ID, the definition, and so on. These annotation, each of these annotation uses what is here in blue, an annotation property. So the annotation property, you can think of it as, I'm opening a million things here. You can think of it of what is going to link your entity to a value. So here, the label, RDFS label, link this Mondo term to the value Alzheimer's disease. The annotation property can link between an ontology term to something. It can also link an annotation itself. So for example, here for the definition, we have database cross-reference. This is also an annotation property, database cross-reference. Another one here, database cross-reference. Sources that we use very often too, will link an annotation to another annotation. And if we actually go to look at annotation property, you can see that an annotation property can have itself an annotation that uses annotation property. If you have any question, just stop me in my track. So annotation property, we probably all have seen that before. This is this tab, entity annotation property. This is the orange. If you're like me and you like colors, this is how I recognize it. And so an annotation property has an ID. So all of those annotation properties that you have here, and depending on your ontology, you might have different one, depending on which one you use. But all of these have their own ID, and those ID can come from different sources. This one is like this. We have also some that come from the gene ontology. We also have some here that come actually that we created in Mondo, like this one here was created in Mondo. So you can either use annotation properties that already exist, or you can create your own if needed, and we will talk about that later. All right, so annotation property can also have a hierarchy. So in this example here, we have a synonym type property that that is the parent term for different synonym type properties. So from a Mondo perspective, we use those property like abbreviation to state that a specific synonym is an abbreviation, and so on. Another example here is we have a Mondo subset, and we have subset property, which is also shown as a hierarchy. So like anywhere else in the ontology, you can have a hierarchy in this annotation property list. I mean, list, right?
Just for nitpicking, you can't actually have a hierarchy of individuals. Not in this, not in Protege at least.
Like here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. All right. So annotation properties, as I said earlier, it connects some individual to a value. But then also it can define which type of annotation you need to have. So for example, if you come here, this one, I'm going to open each annotation, but when you create it, you have the same the same window, basically. So some annotation property will tell you, will define the fact that it needs to be used with a literal RRI or something else. So examples, definition will be used with a literal, and we know that it is going to be a string here. You can see the type here, and when you look in Protege in your annotation window, you actually can see here the type XSD string. So you know that a string will be used with this annotation property. So you can have just, let's say, free text. You can also have, and I'm looking here for another example. Give me 1 second. You could also have a Boolean, like here, the OWL deprecated annotation property needs to be used with a Boolean. So here, this term is obsolete and the annotation is true. So here you can see the type here is the type that is required is Boolean, and I'll show you in a minute where you can define this. Another thing you can have, and I'm looking at my list of examples here. You can have, let's go back here. You can have an RRI. So here it's an example. C also will use an IRI. So it's like a link to something on the internet. Here is a GitHub, a link to GitHub. And this is very useful because then you have a link to somewhere where there might be more information about whatever your annotation here is. So in this case, the GitHub link will give you, this link in GitHub will give you more information about this term, whether we changed it, with some decisions that were made basically about this term. It can also be another annotation property. So here in this example here, we have has exact synonym, and we have has type, has synonym type. If we open this so that you can see, we have the annotation property has synonym type is used with another annotation property from the synonym type property abbreviation.
Sabrina, just one small correction. So here when you're saying it's used with another property, precisely you're using an annotation assertion on top of another annotation assertion. So not just on the annotation property, but also on the value. So on the combination of the annotation property and the value, you will have the annotation.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Nico. It's a good detail. Like words are very important. Yeah. And which one am I missing? Yeah. Another thing you can have is, give me a second to find my example. Is here an individual. So here in this example of, this is a term example of usage, the annotation uses the annotation property has curation status, and has curation status use an individual that has been defined in this this tab. In here is also you use it entity IRI, and you can choose here individual. All right, so where do we schedule? Okay, so where do we define the type of annotation that an annotation property requires? We do that here in the description. So we are back in an annotation property. Here, the annotation property is scheduled for obsolescence on or after. And we define the type of annotation that we need by adding it here in the description range. And so here we defined by using select data type that the annotation needs to be a date. If you can see here in the list, there's a lot of different things. You can, a lot of different data type that you can choose, a string that we talked about earlier, and then here, the one that we used earlier, Boolean. So this is where you can define which type of annotation is expected with which type of annotation property. One thing that is important to note at this time, because it's I don't know where else to say it, is that you can basically, and please don't do that, and I'm going to be using like very bad words here, but you can put pretty much anything you want. You shouldn't, but technically you could put anything you want with annotation property. This will not affect the reasoner. Of course, you shouldn't. You need to think about like what kind of annotation you want to use depending on your ontology and depending on your term. And, you know, of course, needs to be consistent. But in terms of the reasoner, anything that you add here as an annotation will not be affected. You can, of course, create QC check that will check that what you have here in your annotations make sense. But so, for example, we can have QC checks that says we need to have only one label or we need to have only one ID, but the reasoner will not be affected with anything you write in these annotation property. Nico, is it
can I,
correct?
yeah,
Yes.
I just want to even add to that. So basically, if you combine this information, that the reasoner entirely ignores anything related to annotations, no matter what you put in there, with the range restrictions that Sabrina showed before in the annotation properties tab. So basically, we are now moving entirely away from the idea of using range restrictions for annotation properties in ontologies. And I think it's, as far as I know, this has never actually had any effect on any practical application in any case. So what we want to do is we are defining new validation techniques with, for example, LinkML-based validation, and implemented as Chris does it in the ontology access kit oak. Or with shackle shapes and so on. So we are defining the rules, the constraints on these annotation properties outside of the actual ontology, not inside of it, and then use a bespoke validation program to look whether the ontology is complying to these restrictions. So for example, if you're saying this property has as a range a Boolean, like I will deprecate it. Right now, if anyone would add a string true instead of an owl Boolean true, nothing bad would happen because there's no, the reasoner ignores this entirely. But if we have like an external validation process, we can check basically are all our owl deprecated annotations in the ontology correctly done to Boolean values. So here it's just like one more piece that you should remember when we are doing anything in annotations. It will never be affected by reasoning. We sometimes refer to this as meta modeling. So just talking about one specific class. And the most important thing that you need to remember is, while any other statement, like in the description panel down here, like a subclass of assertion and so on, of a class will automatically inherit down to all of its children. Anything you say in the annotations group, none of this will automatically be inherited down to its children. So you can say safely, even like what we do sometimes in cheekily, this is also what Sabrina's warning of, like sometimes we are using statements like this disease is related to this other disease, and we put this in the annotation panel just to make sure that this relationship is not inherited down to the children. So for example, when we are using SCOS, exact match to other terminologies and similar. So just for a little bit more on this issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Nico. One more thing I want to point out is what annotation properties are not, because that could be confusing, or the words are similar, so we can get confused. So annotation properties, we've been talking about that since the beginning of this call. They're in orange. They are not object property. This is something different. Object property here in blue. In Protégé, if you go by color, it's annotation properties are basically the relation between classes. It's what connects pairs of individuals. We talked about that. Oh yes, sorry, object. We have talked about that in past tutorials. So just find them in our list. It's things like has part. So it has also properties like, it has a characteristic like it can be inverse, symmetric, asymmetric, reflective, all this good things that we discussed in the past. Annotation properties are also not data properties. They are in green in the ontology. I had to look for another ontology to find some, because we didn't use them in Mondo, and it's my understanding with what I could find that it's something we don't really use often. It basically, a data property will connect an individual with a literal, and it does that in a way that affects the reasoning. That's really the important part. So here I am going to this ontology, OMRSE ontology. It's ontology of medically related social entities. There, that's the full name. They use, so one example we can think about, it would be if you wanted to have, I'm going to make up something like high blood pressure, and you would have a data property that would be has blood pressure value, and then you would use a head blood pressure value to define your term high blood pressure. So here in this ontology, the data property has X coordinate value, and then they use this has X coordinate value here in the description to define what the X coordinate value has to be for this term. So in this case, the data property will affect reasoning because it is used here as a subclass and not as an annotation.
So yeah, it's
yes.
Perfect. You said it exactly perfectly. So I would just add that. So some people like the fact that they can do things like defining ranges, for example. So they can say high blood pressure is defined as having more than 180, I don't know, no, not 180, 130 or something, 120 systolic blood pressure over 80 or something like that. So you can define a range. It should be at least that up to, I don't know, another value. So you can have like a class that says if an individual, so you can put a restriction on a class saying that any instance of that class must have a range between this and that. So the reason I would complain if it would encounter a measurement that is outside this range, or you can even define a class in terms of this range to say this is, so a high blood pressure measurement is a measurement that has a measurement value between this and that range. And then you can infer for any given measurement that you have done, you can infer that this is supposed to be high blood pressure. But that said, I mean, if you follow this family history tutorial, this was all a great idea in the beginning of our modeling, and people do it, and people have done it. We are not really doing this very much, not just because these values are often changing and they add expressivity and make things complex. I don't know. So I think that from a habit perspective, I would say they belong probably in a different part of our stack rather than directly in the ontology. These kinds of links of like reference ranges, for example, in medical sciences to ontology phenotypes. But yeah, so just as a heads up, like in our domain, almost never we will see any of these range restrictions with using data properties at all.
Thank you, Nico. Any questions? Because we're gonna move towards creating new annotation properties. So if there's any questions, now is a good time.
I also monitor the chat. If people have questions, they can just ask in the chat, and then I can relay them to Sabrina and when she pauses her breath. So you can just continue, Sabrina, if you want.
Okay. Okay. So how do we create a new annotation property? So let's say you are working on your ontology. You feel like you need to have you think you need to have another annotation here. How do you go about it? So first thing, like we do with absolutely every single annotation, every single things in our ontology world, is to look for if an annotation property already exists, because we want to make sure we stay as consistent as possible with the world around us, right? So you can look at other ontologies. And I think Nico, you already put it in the chat. The ontology metadata information artifact ontology is a good place to find existing annotation properties. So you can look at this ontology. You can probably also request terms if you think this is something that everybody in the ontology world could use. And then if it is, then if it exists, then reuse that term. Obviously, you can import this entire ontology into your ontology. We talked about that in previous tutorials. So if you want to do that or you need to do that, we have documentation on how to do that. Let's say that I couldn't find what I was looking for, then let's create a new annotation property. So I ask a million questions about that, and it seems like at this point there's not really a clear decision about how we should do things, whether we should create ID that looks like in a certain way, this sort of thing. So I'm going to show you what I do. Just keep in mind that some of the things I'm going to tell you might change as the decision within the obo-academy, the obo foundry, change. So first thing is that you can look at the ID here. Here are IDs that we created in Mondo. So these have the ID is like the obo-library.org, obo, and then we have Mondo with a hashtag and the name of the annotation property. Of course, now I'm going to see only the one from Mondo here. You have another one from the gene ontology. It uses something, an ID that is similar. The IRO, you have an actual ID. So when I want to create a new annotation property that will be, let's say, for Mondo, I will use the same format for the ID. Creating a new annotation property is like create a new class. I like to use these little buttons here. And because if I start writing the name new property, you can see that as with all of us, it autofilled to my next available ID. So to have the same format, what you do, you basically type the whole ID there. So I will.
Can I ask? So one question that neither you nor me can answer at the moment, but I would ask it if I would see you doing what you're doing. Why are we using a weird IRI like that and not a normal IRI that we usually use for classes? So that's kind of like the reasonable and difficult question to answer. And I think there is like, this is one thing that where, we all have to kind of do a little bit of work and figure out how to best do this moving forward. Because these IRIs that you see here in front of you that have the structure Perl obo library / obo / and then the ID space in lowercase with like a hash code and then the, let's say, ID of the annotation. This is actually something that doing it like that stems from the behavior of, as far as I know at least, of the behavior of the obo to owl conversion process. So in the original obo to owl mapping, so when you're converting an obo ontology to an owl ontology, in the converter, let's say, someone, probably Chris or someone that was working with him at this time, decided to export properties that were defined inside of the ontology, inside of the obo file, using this IRI scheme into RDF. So this led basically to like hundreds, probably multiple hundreds of properties defined in this way. And many of us, like, for example, in Mondo and HBO and probably others, have continued to use this IRI scheme for defining our new ontologies. And for now, when you're asking, what should we use? The answer is, I would say it's okay to use this annotations, to use this scheme because it's so widely used, but it is also okay to use the numeric scheme. I'm saying that despite being slightly, I have fought a couple of battles for more human readable annotation properties. I've lost. But I've seen many annotations properties being defined using a numeric scheme. So both are possible in the Mondo, HPO, Uberon, CL, Pato, RO sphere. For now, I recommend, just because most of them are defined in this kind of way, and maybe not even RO, let's say minus RO. I don't even know what RO is in what's in RO, but for Uberon, Mondo, and HP and CL, use this kind of way of defining the IRI. Thank you. That was a bit extensive, but I would have that question. So if I would see it, so I would answer it.
Yeah, no, thank you, because I remember having the same question at the time. And so, yeah, and as I said, like, well, yeah, things are changing as decisions are coming, but then also my rule of thumb is to look at what is happening in your own ontology, and then make sure you follow what you follow what is happening, the conventions in your own ontology. I think, like, if you're going to be consistent, at least be consistent within your own ontology. I mean, I don't. Anyways, so create new annotation property. Okay. And then you can add whatever annotations you want. And again, it doesn't look like there's very specific rules. So you can add pretty much whatever you want. If maybe your ontology requires you to add a curator node, or who created that term. I think there's not official, air quote, official rules. The things that really everybody should have, I think, is the label. So where is the label? Here, new property, because I have so much imagination. And also, one thing that you need to have is to have the is metadata tag and true. And I'm sure Nico can give better explanation than mine, but it seems like my understanding is that in order for obo to recognize this new annotation property, we need to have the is metadata tag true annotation. Why? I don't know. We just learn it the hard way.
So basically, for those of you that are curating in Uberon or Mondo, I think just these two. I'm not sure right now. Maybe, yeah. I think every ontology that is where the edit file is in obo format, you will have to add this property in order for the extraction process to understand that you've just added an annotation property. This is probably a bug that should be fixed in the obo to OWL conversion process. If you are in an OWL edit file, then what happens is that it automatically, during the translation into obo, understands that this is supposed to be an annotation property in the obo sense, and then it will add the is metadata tag true thing to it during the conversion. So other way around is fine. If you are editing in an obo ontology, you have to add is metadata tag true, and really be careful also with the data type again here, that it is XSD Boolean and not just a string.
All right, thank you, Nico. So now we have our new property. We can use it to make any annotations like we talked about earlier, annotation to other annotation property, annotation to your class, whatever you need to do. Any questions in real life or in the chat?
I would also just like to add that exactly in the same way as we are modeling classes, and even more so when we are modeling annotation properties, I think being careful with providing metadata, so adding annotations on the annotation property itself is important so that other people could have a hope to reuse them. So for example, I put a link in the chat of what of like a minimal schema I'm proposing for OMO. So these are like the minimal annotation properties that I would require for any kind of annotation property to be created. And I think that even if you create one inside of your own ontology, this is a reasonable minimum annotation set. So in particular, very useful is example of use and having a term tracker item related. These are very important. And of course, always a definition, and doesn't have to be a weird OBO style definition, like BFO style definition, just something that makes it easy for an external person to understand what this property means and how it should be used during curation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because if we're going to be reusing annotation properties between ontologies, we need to make sure we're doing it the way it was intended to.
That's right.
I'll definitely add this to the documentation. This link. All right. This is all I have for you today. If anybody wants to practice creating new annotation properties, we can do that. Of course, if there's any questions or anything else, we can also do that. I am following your lead.
So I would like to raise the kind of general question of should we, like, this is again one question we can't really answer very well, but should we actually create annotation properties or not? Like, that's like not at least in our own ontology. So we don't really have any guidelines in OBO at the moment. For you, basically, for many people, like in Mondo, you have the situation that you encounter a modeling need. Like, for example, you were showing before this need for a new property for excluding, for example, QC checks for particular classes. And but these annotation properties seem like they belong in a general ontology, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to say this is Mondo specific, and then if people start reusing this IRI in other ontologies and it says Mondo in the IRI, it seems also a bit, confusing. Why is this in the Mondo namespace rather than in some general namespace, let's say? So maybe if anyone here has an opinion, so yeah, here Bradley has already given the thumbs up on this one here, so feel free to so first of all, maybe let's ask this: did any one of you ever have to create annotation properties before? I'm sure at least Alan, for sure you have created an annotation property, or not? No. All right. Nicole, I know she has.
Yeah.
Okay. No. Okay. Good. No, it doesn't happen. Yeah, you had to remove annotation. Harry says he has to remove annotation properties because obviously they are also, since they are not in the logical structure, they also are kind of like a hotbed for like bad content. So very often we have to prune them away from ontologies for many different purposes, including knowledge graph injections. Well, okay, if there's no one else doing modeling annotation properties, did you all understand annotation properties a little bit from Sabrina's explanation now? I'm waiting
It's
for
okay to say yes or no. I will not take it badly.
Sarah, Bradley, and Lauren have confirmed. Good. Awesome. Does anyone, I mean, so for my, Chris wants to say something, so let's have him say.
I had a question.
All right.
Now that we're all super duper OWL people, we'll say Mondo annotations or Go annotations. But do we not run the risk of kind of confusing curators or bioinformaticians who, when they hear Mondo annotation or Go annotation, they think of genes annotations? How do we kind of like communicate in a way that is kind of unambiguous here? Is there a recommended terminology to use here? Because I see this confusion happening a lot.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, you have to answer us this great question, Chris. So
no, I'm open to ideas, but yeah.
I've heard you say this, use this word ontology meta modeling sometimes. This covers some of the aspects, but
sometimes
yeah.
I just say OWL annotation if I mean,
Yeah.
if I want to avoid that confusion and
No,
associations or gene associations, but yeah.
Yeah, OWL annotations is also, yeah, it doesn't feel very satisfying, but it's true. It's like if you wanted to separate these two, it's probably one of the words that most people would use. Anyone else have encountered any other ways of putting it?
No, I remember when I started, almost a year ago when I started working on ontology, that was my big confusion, annotations, because annotation meant something very different for me than annotation here in Protégé, where you see annotations. So I don't have a good solution except always giving the context, like an annotation for an ontology term versus an annotation, for gene to phenotype or this sort of things.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, just know who you're talking to and always give give disambiguating context if need be.
Add that with a big fat sentence to the documentation also, that biocuration annotations are not at all anything like OWL annotations. Does anyone else have a question that, around annotation properties? With more than 10 minutes, we can also delve into adjacent areas. Feel free to ask anything that you want to ask. If not, then we can also close early, whatever you prefer. Did you, Chris? I didn't realize that you were here. Sorry, but did you?
Sorry, I was looking. Yeah.
Do you want to add anything on your perspective about the dichotomy between annotation properties and data properties, and what is your opinion actually on data properties? Because we just realized that you never, like, in none of your ontologies you would see any relevant data property usage. So do you have, like, is it something that just you don't need to model with literals very much, or is this coincidental, or do you just?
I think you covered it. Yeah. I mean, if you're representing data in OWL, then they're useful. But for modeling the actual ontology itself, for the classes in the ontology, there's not really so much use for them. I mean, occasionally you'll see people saying, "Oh, I want this. I need to record the reference range maybe in the environment ontology for this environment. These are the upper and lower temperature ranges." Or maybe there's a temptation to do this in HPO to say, okay, this is like the reference range for this level of this kind of chemical in the blood or something like that. But when you start doing things like that in ontologies, you're making very, very kind of like hard and fast statements that you're saying every instance of this class has this reference range. And ultimately, they're not really so useful. That kind of thing is often better done outside the ontology. So, we've got the link to HPO project that links reference ranges of various kinds of like, lab values to actual HPO terms. I think that's probably, that kind of pattern is going to be useful elsewhere. But others, if we were to have this conversation kind of more broadly outside of the kind of like some of the more monarch-centric ontologies here, then others may have other opinions on that. But I don't think it's just on the ontologies we work on. I haven't seen a lot of these in any of the obo ontologies, to be honest. But I may be looking in the wrong places.
Yeah, we had to search, like we had to literally go through like 15 ontologies before we even find one, and even there it's very sporadic. Only I think there are some, like, in ontologies like drawn, where you have like, where you model some kind of like drug, but it's also just like as if you were modeling metadata, like if you want to say
Exactly,
that this drug has so and so much, this pill has so and so much milligram of this ingredient or something like that, then I don't this is again a question of like, where exactly does this belong? And here I guess what I wanted to get from you is in these kinds of cases, are we hoping to drive? So is kind of like the rule of thumb here something like, if it's useful for classification in some way, then yes, maybe we can consider it. But if it's not useful for classification, it's purely for documentative purposes, then maybe other kind of mechanisms are better for capturing this kinds of information.
I think it's a good rule of thumb. I mean, I think if it's correct and it's useful just for querying as well, that's a good reason to do it. There's a strong case for something like drawn, where you're actually making classes that are kind of this particular formulation of this drug. I mean, it seems odd to you use an ontology and an OWL for doing such a thing anyway. That seems more like a catalog you'd put in a database. But if that's what you're doing, maybe it's not useful for classification, but it's useful for querying, because someone, presumably if you're using drawn, it's because you want to know things like, amount of a particular formulation. So yeah, and the OWL statement can even be quite useful if you want to make kind of like ranges there, but it does get kind of quite complex, because then you've got to figure out how to bring units into this. You have to have a kind of standard, normalize everything according to one unit, because OWL isn't so good at doing unit type reasoning. I feel we just start going outside the realm of what's useful to do in an ontology, and it's maybe better to do using a more classical database type framework, or just in a kind of RDF knowledge base outside the ontology. But yeah, just the other thing that's sort of like slightly unsatisfactory is this classification of annotation versus, on the one hand, versus data and object on the other. It's maybe not quite satisfying, because in some ways we'd like our metadata properties to declare them as object versus data. We want to say RDFS label, the value of that should be a a string. We want to be able to say, I know we don't have so many that are kind of that are objects, but maybe like C also should be the value of that should be an IRI. So in some ways they are kind of like data properties and object properties already, but just it's just a way of working with OWL that is just easier if the things that are metadata about the class and not about the individuals of that class, that you model them as annotation properties. But it does lead to some confusion sometimes when we want to reuse properties that are being used by other groups who have already declared something we want to use as a data property or an object property. But in those cases, we just bring them in and say these are annotation properties within our domain. But that's not something you really encounter on a day-to-day basis. That's more decision making at the level of a whole ontology rather than a kind of term within an ontology.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to quickly answer Bradley's question here. So he asks why there are multiple ways or three different created by annotation properties. And the question is this intended? If yes, why? If no, how do we fix it? So basically, let's start with the the quick answer to is this intended? It's not intended, like in the sense of that someone wanted to do 3 properties, but it is basically a historical accident that there are actually more than even 3, and in CL we just have 3. So, but what happened is over the kind of realms of time, and we are still in that process, and you will see this in many different ontologies, is that so we, on the one hand, we have this culture, and this is also very useful for all of you to kind of like understand this, is where that is driven more from the kind of obo go type history. So where we have the obo format, and then when this obo format was sort of turned into mapped into OWL and linked into where you had the necessity to actually provide IRIs for all of the different properties. This is when many of these kind of annotation properties like created by actually started emerging. So you have like this created by property from like an ontology that was originally created in obo, where you just say created by : and then the author name. And then you have like the later standards, like using DC creator, or using DC contributor, or using even, you will find even this, what Sabrina showed before with like Mondo, and then hash code created by, even that you will accidentally happen in some cases. So all of these cases happen, and yes, we absolutely want to consolidate these. And there are a bit of like disagreements on how exactly to do that, but what I'm trying to push forward, and everyone that works with me is basically coerced into doing so, is to use Dublin core vocabulary for authors. So while there are concerns about historical things, like what happened to past annotations in Go, it's lots of work to fix them. But for us, like in CL, in Pato, in Uberon, in HPO, in MP, all of the Ufino ontologies, Mondo, and so on, we want to use DC properties. And personally, so like you can use DC creator if you want to, and you can see that some of the QC checks DC creator passes through normally. But I personally would like, just for simplicity, to, because I feel like ontology terms are sort of created over time, and people fix stuff and people reclassify them, and I feel it's more like an organic thing. So I don't really believe that the original author of a term is so awesomely important as it is sometimes pointed out by others. So I personally prefer if everyone were to use DC contributor always. But I don't mind if you want to say DC creator as well on top of it. But a DC contributor is the thing that we want to consolidate on. So yes, Bradley, we have to get rid of every other mention of created by in favor of DC contributor. And I think that Anita has done amazing, tremendous work in fixing this in many of our ontologies already. I'm surprised you even find some of these cases in CL still. And adding, okay, good. Maybe Anita, you can take a quick look if and get rid of these, and then add to this QC check to ensure that they never come back again.
No, actually, I didn't
do it for
replace
this
yet. Yeah, for the CL. I'm
okay,
gonna do.
All right, awesome, good. There's the answer. So this thing with the answering with emoticons, awesome. Okay, all right, Sabrina, thank you very much for your tutorial, and thank you everyone for attending. Next time we will do a tutorial on application development, application ontology development. So it's sometimes I feel it's slightly premature because we are about to change everything, but in any case, the basic thought processes will always remain the same. So I hope you will come and join and talk about, and it will be interesting to you. So application ontology, basically no curation, no adding terms, no, or very minimal in any case. You want to build an ontology that pulls together terms from various ontology, connects them, and puts them all together. So that's kind of like what we want to do next time. So thank you very much for being here, and thanks, Sabrina, and see you all.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you
Okay,
for everything.
great tutorial.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.